Welcome, everybody. My name is John Golden from Pipeline Air Sales. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer. And today I am going to be interviewing author of a brand new book called The Science of Selling, David Hoffeld. You can see the book here on screen, available in Kindle, hardcover, and even Audible. The Science of Selling, Proven Strategies to Make Your Pitch, Influence Decisions, and Close the Deal. And as you can see, it's receiving some tremendous feedback. It's got some tremendous editorial reviews. And, if you're looking for a business book to read this holiday season, I'd highly recommend it. As you can see, I actually I gave a testimonial to it myself here. So it's a book that I thoroughly enjoyed. And so without any further ado, let me just get rid of this here, and I will invite David here, as you can see on screen. And David and I are going to have a conversation about the book today. So welcome, David.
Hey, John. Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you.
Yeah. So, David, just before we start, give the audience a little bit of your background and where the idea of writing this book came from.
Yeah, I have been in sales for many years prior to ever really beginning to get into the science of that undergirds the sales process. And I had been a salesperson, a sales manager, director of sales, VP of sales for many different companies, and always been successful. And I'd always been a student of sales training. But what happened was I basically ran across an academic journal in social psychology, which is literally defined as the scientific study of how human beings are influenced in a social setting. And I read one of the articles in the journal and I thought, wow, this is really applicable to what I do every day as a sales professional. So I applied what I learned. And then I shared it with the team that I was managing at the time, and they applied it, and we all started to see some results from it. And so that really created a hunger for me, and I began to say, well, what else is out there like this? Mm-hmm. So I developed a very odd hobby, John, of reading academic journals.
Wow.
In the evenings, after work, on the weekends, and I just saw such relevance for what I was doing as a sales professional, what my team was doing, and how we sold. And we started applying these research-backed insights and built strategies on them, and the results, sales increased significantly. The company became one of the fastest growing companies in the United States, and sales just skyrocketed. We grew by 400% our sales in 1 year. I mean, we were one of the Inc. 5000 list. All kind of neat stuff happened. And so then that really fanned my hunger, and I just poured myself, became obsessed with looking at this real science, like from cognitive psychology or social neuroscience and behavioral economics, and saying, how can I apply this to selling? And boy, fast forward many years later, I launched my firm in 2009 of January, and been helping clients all around the world. And the book, The Science of Selling, just came out that details really how you can apply the science of how the brain is wired to buy and wired to be influenced into virtually every area of sales. And so it's been an exciting journey.
Yeah, it's funny. Just starting there, where you started reading academic journals, which is quite an undertaking for anybody, even people in academia.
Yes.
But it always kind of bothers me a bit. And I had this conversation with Daniel Strunk from DePaul University as well a few weeks ago about how little connection there really is between academia and sales. It's like every university in the country pretty much has a marketing program, right? But he gave me the number, there's like 200 or 300 maybe that have a sales program of some kind. And yet the ratio of marketing people to salespeople in the real world is completely the inverse. So, why do you think that is, before we get into the book, why do you think that is that sales has never really been an academic, pursuit at university?
It's a fascinating question. I asked that a number of years ago as well. Why hadn't someone done this? Why hadn't someone taken this wealth of research and applied it to selling? And I studied that historically. I try to be a student of sales history to make sure that we don't repeat some of the same mistakes. And I put this in the latter chapter of the book very briefly in about 4 or 5 pages. It's fascinating, John, because what the research shows is that in the early part of the 20th century, there were more courses on selling in universities than there are today.
Oh, wow.
So more in 1925 than there are now in 2016 as we go into 2017. What happened? Well, sales was the driver of really the economy. Companies would make products and then give it to salespeople. They called them at that time drummers, and they would go out and try to drum up business. They would knock on doors, go to businesses, and try to sell these products in the early part of the 20th century. What the research shows is that there was a major shift in the business philosophy regarding sales and marketing. Marketing was still in its infancy at this time, not really a key player in comparison to sales. But when the crash of 29 happened, businesses, many of them, the economy was decimated. Businesses went into survival mode. And it's fascinating to see the literature that comes out of the business world pre-1929 and just after 1929. After 1929, what happens is businesses shift their whole philosophy and they say, what does the customer want? Let's find out and let's make it for them. So for example, in the book, I talk about Ford. Ford Motor Company goes out and surveys 1 million motorists in 1931, and they say, what kind of car do you want? How much will you pay for it? And then they make it because they want to minimize risk. So they're not trying to innovate anymore. They're trying to survive, and that makes sense. All of us in that climate would have done the same thing. What happens, though, is there's a shift in academia because of this. All of a sudden, sales courses are pushed aside and marketing is embraced because that's now the new driver of business. So as a result, marketing flourishes. Academia embraces marketing, which is why every, even major and minor university, even small community colleges have courses or majors on marketing, and sales, as you mentioned so well, not so much. And so that has never been reversed. It's starting to see a little bit of a shift, but because of what happened from my research in the early part of the 20th century, that major shift, marketing was taken seriously and studied, and sales, unfortunately, was given to those that have the gift of gab, and it's unfortunately remained there ever since.
Yeah, that's fascinating insight. Yeah, I was wondering where that whole thing came from, and I mean that makes total sense to me. I mean, it's something that needs to be addressed, and as you said, there are some people addressing it because statistics show that the majority of people who come out of college, their first job is in sales. So it's amazing how everybody goes to college, or a lot of people go to college, they get a degree, and the one thing that they end up doing is the one thing that's not covered in most colleges. So it's quite fascinating. So let's get into the book, because I know you've divided the book into a number of parts. So let's kind of do it chronologically and just start at the beginning, because for me, I think chapter 1 is probably the chapter that'll grab a lot of people's attention, because it's the perennial problem that everybody has and everybody scratches their head probably around this time of year, especially for companies who haven't made their quota, who haven't made their targets this year, and they look down their sales team and they ask that question, why are my salespeople underperforming? So tell us a little bit about that, because I'm sure that's something that will fascinate a lot of people.
Yes, that's really the root of the issue. And you're exactly right. We've been studying this in sales. In fact, I did stand on the shoulders of some great thought leaders, friends of ours, I know, John, mutual friend Dave Stein. He's done a lot of great research in this to show how people have been underperforming and how we've missed quota for years and years now. It's a consistent theme that between nearly 40 to 50% of all salespeople, depending on the year, the surveys show, will fail to meet their quota. So what in the world is going on? And there's a number of issues, but I think the primary one that's not being addressed, and I think this is a major issue, is the way we are selling. We talk a lot about different technologies which are needed and important, as you well know, like a good CRM system can make a huge difference in a salesperson's performance. But utilizing social media, there's so many other factors we need to do well. But how do we sell? What are the behaviors we engage in? Because here's what the research shows. One study out of Harvard Business Review found that when 800 salespeople were studied on sales calls, actual sales calls, they found that 63% of the salespeople regularly behaved in ways that drove down the likelihood of the sale. Only 37% of those salespeople were consistently effective. And unfortunately, every piece of data we have from within the sales world, the sales training world, shows pretty much the same thing. We have an alarming problem. And one of the root issues is the way we sell. Why do we choose one behavior versus another? Why do we try to build value this way versus that way? And in the past, for the most part, we've tried to figure it out via trial and error. So we'll try a couple things and try to figure it out, which is problematic for so many reasons. We try to basically guess our way to success. And the best thing we've come up with is we try to do best practices. I
Hmm.
call it innovating by looking in the mirror. We look in the mirror and we say, okay, who's doing the best of us? And we
Right.
try to copy those people. The problem is, I think the root of the issue is, who are we focused on? We're focused too much on ourselves as sellers.
Hmm.
And what we should be focused on is our buyers, because that's who this is all for anyway. And so what we say in that first chapter is the root of the problem with selling is selling. We're focusing not on buying, but on selling. And so we say you need to understand, how do people make a buying decision? Not just the buyer's journey, but what happens inside of my mind for me to say yes to your product or service? What's going on there? And the great news is there is so much research. We say there's an ocean of research, decades and decades of it, thousands of studies that reveal how our brains make choices and the factors that influence what we say, how we act, what we decide to buy. And oftentimes, because we're not aware of this and our strategies aren't built on it, the big problem, John, is that we contradict it, meaning we sell in ways that are antagonistic to how our brains make choices. And this, I believe, is the root of the problem in selling right now, is we are literally not selling the way the brain is wired to buy, and it's costing us a tremendous amount of sales.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that about how most organizations say, "Oh, let's look at the guys who are doing well and copy them." As you know, I mean, I ran Huthwaite for a while, which was spin selling, which is based on the work of Neil Rackham, his best-selling book. And when he did his seminal study like 35, 40 years ago now, one of the things that he discovered was, you go to top performing salespeople, right? They don't know what they do well. It wasn't until he studied them and found the thing and found the common traits across them. So in organizations where they go, oh look, there's Mary or over there, she's our top salesperson, or there's Joe, is our top salesperson. Go talk to them, and they'll explain. They often don't know why they're successful. So this is why this is fascinating. And in the next couple of chapters, you talk about two methods of influence, and then you talk about selling to people the way they want to buy. And that for me just sounds like, I mean, that is a really important piece, but it's it's almost counterintuitive to most salespeople, right? Because they're taught to control the sales process, right? Not to align to it so much, but to control it.
You're exactly right. It's a whole different philosophy. And this is the thing we have to start with, because we say this: what is success or failure in selling? Here's what I would suggest, and the research confirms, is that the closer your way of selling is aligned with how the brain forms a buying decision, the more effective you'll be. The further away your way of selling is from how the brain forms a buying decision, the less effective you'll be. So the starting place is always with our buyers. And in sales, as you know, John,
Hmm.
we often say things like that. I'm prospect centric, and we want to
Yeah.
focus on our buyers, and but in reality, then we go doing what we want anyway. So we say we need to focus on, why should I sell this way versus that way?
Hmm.
And the great news is there's evidence that shows us now. There's a wealth of data. One person I was just talking to told me, he said, what it's like. It's like when pilots are flying planes. You're always told, to focus on your instruments, because oftentimes your perceptions are wrong
Hmm.
and you can be misguided, but your instruments are always right. They'll always guide you to know where you should go, whether you're right side up or upside down, and so on. And so the same is true with science. It discloses reality. And when we leverage this wealth of research, we can literally now really sell the way that our potential customers' brains are wired to buy, which really helps them form confident buying decisions, perceive high levels of value. So it's mutually beneficial. It's not something we do to them, it's something we literally do with and for them. And people like being sold to in this way. We've seen that across the board with all the companies we've worked with. And even in the early stages testing this out, people enjoyed being sold to in this way, for the simple reason that it's how their brains are wired to make decisions anyway. So it helps them form good, confident buying decisions.
So what are some of the common mistakes that some maybe less successful salespeople make, David?
Yeah, unfortunately, there's a lot. One of the biggest ones that we talk about in the book is the way we think about closing the sale.
Hmm.
And there's been a lot of people pushing back on closing over the last decade, and rightly so, where smart people in sales have said, wait a minute, it can't just be this big commitment at the end of the sale. There's something wrong with that, and people don't like being sold to that way anymore, and they're absolutely right, but it's far deeper than that. What the research shows is that our brains don't form buying decisions that way, meaning we don't wait till the end of a sales call and then we form a buying decision. What the research conclusively shows is that we're forming our buying decision throughout the sales call via certain incremental commitments. And these incremental commitments are literally the building blocks of the entire sale. They're how my brain and your brain, our brains, form buying decisions. And so we know what these commitments are, and if even one of them is not made, the sale breaks down, it results in an objection, and the buying decision we found never occurs. So what is the goal of a sales process? It should be to guide our potential customers in making certain incremental commitments that guide them on a progression of consent, naturally advance the sale, and lead into that final commitment at the end of the sale of a positive buying decision. So oftentimes we think of it just as something that happens at the end of the sale.
Yeah.
No, what happens at the end of the sale is a symptom of what's happened earlier. And so we need to rethink of not how do we want to sell or what are the books on sales say, but how does the brain make a buying decision, and then help people through that journey.
Yeah, I love that, David, because one of the things that we did with Pipeliner CRM about a year or so ago was we built in the ability to put in each stage of the sales process is buyer actions, right? Because as you know, one of the big things that I learned when I was running Huthwaite, and we used to teach the companies that we worked with, was it doesn't really matter what the salesperson is doing. It matters what the buyer is doing, right? The prospect is doing. So if the prospect is doing nothing during the sales process, so if I say to you, I come back and I say, David, it's fantastic. I had a great meeting with the prospect. And you say, well, what happened? And I said, well, they've agreed to another meeting in 2 weeks' time. And you say, that's great, John. What are they doing in the meantime? And I'm like, well, nothing. I'm going to prepare for the next meeting. You say, so, okay, so the sales process hasn't moved 1 inch. I just have a second meeting, right? And that's why we built that into the system, like buyer actions, all about buyer actions. And so I totally agree with you. So let's move on. And this is all part of what you've been speaking about, but buyer emotions, and you have a chapter on buyer emotions. And I think that's something that some salespeople often overlook, that at the end of the day, the buying process is quite an emotional process in itself, because let's face it, when you make a consumer buying decision, right? If I go out and buy something today, what's the worst that can happen to me? I can waste some money. Maybe it doesn't turn out to be what I thought it was. Maybe my wife goes, "What the hell? Why did you waste money on this stupid thing?" Right? So maybe I get an angry wife and I've wasted money. Things that are, surmountable. But in a B2B, in a business buying decision, it can be a career enhancing thing, or it can be a career limiting thing if it doesn't work out. So, and I think often salespeople overlook that emotional piece. So talk a little bit about the emotions of the buyer.
Yes, this was something we spent about 6 years on. This was the part of the book that took me the longest to break through and really figure out, because I was able to get to what those commitments are that I mentioned earlier. It took about 3.5, 4 years of specific research in that area, leveraging the existing science, but applying it in the real world of sales on sales calls. But the emotions stumped me. And I've always heard that people buy on emotions and justify with logic. But usually that's where the conversation ends then. Like, how do you know that, number one? And what do you do because of it, number two? Most sales training, they don't know what to say. So I said, well, do emotions even matter? And what factor do they have in the sale? What I stumbled on that really helped me was there's quite a bit of research from neuroscience on this, studying people that do not have access to their emotions. So these are individuals that have had brain injuries and they cannot use their emotions. They can't access them when making decisions. So how do they make decisions? That would give us a major insight into what emotions do in the decision-making process.
For sure.
And the sad reality is that they don't make decisions, or they make very poor ones. And what the research conclusively shows is that emotions are how we assign value. It's how we create preferences. One neuroscientist said it best. He said it's the logical part of your brain, your neocortex, for example, that allows you to look at a person walking towards you and say, she is my cousin. But it's the emotional part of your brain that allows you then to say, and I can't stand her, right? It's that preference,
Mm-hmm.
that we can't act, if we don't have access to our emotions, we can't make it. So it's fascinating. So emotions matter a lot in sales, to your point, because they're how we assign value. So if we don't connect with people on an emotional level, they will not buy your product or service. They will not see value. In other words, they just won't care at all. And so there's a wealth of research I was able to find on this. I mean, decades of studies, I mean, hundreds of studies that have shown that when people are experiencing negative emotions, they have a very difficult time making a positive decision. It doesn't matter if it's a buying decision. One fascinating study found even judicial rulings are skewed if the judge is in a negative emotional state. There's all kind of fascinating research that shows conclusively emotions matter in decision making. They're mission critical. There's no doubt about that now. And so we must be attentive to them.
Right. So that's a good piece of advice. So next time you're standing in front of a judge, first thing you should say is, "What kind of mood are you in today, Your Honor?"
And there's been a lot of journal articles about that. When should you talk to the judge? Early in the, if you can control it, when. And
Yeah.
there's actually some interesting data on that too. So yeah, it's fascinating stuff.
Well, hopefully that won't come into play.
No,
So
not
let's
for
move
us.
it.
Not for us, John.
Not for us, exactly. So let's move on to the second part of the book, and you start off with obviously an area that most, familiar with most people, most salespeople, around questioning. But you have the chapter, and you call it powerful questioning. Now, there's, even the most rookie of salesperson knows they have to go ask questions. But as we've seen over the years, there's a huge difference between, as you say, powerful questions and irritating questions, or useless questions, or mildly interesting questions. So talk a little bit about powerful questions.
Yeah, when we started looking at questions, we looked at a number of the different models out there. And one of the big questions that we asked early on, this is many years ago now, was how does the brain disclose information? Because we thought if we could understand how the brain discloses information, we could help people create robust follow-up questions, which is really where a lot of salespeople struggle. They'll walk in with some basic questions to start conversations with, but then they have to customize them on the fly,
Mm-hmm.
and oftentimes that gets very complex for them, and they have a hard time doing that, many of them. So we said, how can we create really powerful follow-up questions? Because that's where really the meat is, as every salesperson knows, that you can use on the fly. And so we looked at this research that showed that our brains disclose information essentially in layers. We meet someone, we disclose some introductory information, and then we continue as we get to know them, our trust levels goes up, disclose more and more. The researchers refer to it as peeling back layers of an onion. And that's kind of what we're doing with our questionings. We have some introductory questions, and then we want to get to really the beliefs and the motivations and what's going on in our buyer's mind that we can understand and then leverage in the sales process. And so we began to create a model of questioning based on this research that shows how our brains disclose information. And so we call it levels of questions. We say there's three essential levels. First level is introductory questions that disclose a thought, fact, feeling, behavior. The second level, though, is where we found a lot of great salespeople live. This is the most common type or level of question they ask, which is second level questions, which asks people to assess or explain a first level response. So I want you to assess something or explain it, assess or explain. So they're very easy to create on the fly. So you can listen to your potential customer, focus on what he or she is saying, and then you can create robust follow-up questions with ease. Assess or explain, assess or explain. And the third level is what we get into: desire for gain or fear of loss, kind of the outcome questions. What do we want? What's going to happen if you move forward? What happens if you don't move forward? And it allows really to create really robust follow-up questions, which is really unique about this model. And especially that second level, which we found is where top salespeople live. Where salespeople that struggle live primarily is that first level. They ask a lot of introductory questions, don't get into a lot of depth, so they only understand surface information. It's that second level, that assessing and explaining, where you can really open up a topic and really get some really meat that you can later leverage in the sales process to really show your potential customer how your solution can truly meet their needs.
Mm-hmm. And as you move on in the next couple of chapters, you talk about creating value in the process, right? And lots of people talk about that. My favorite one was actually, going back to Neil Rackham again, is he used to say, If you've truly created value in a sales call or a sales interaction, you should be able to say to the customer, would you pay me for this? Would you pay, not for the product I'm selling to you, but would you pay me for the sales call? And he put it to the and I used to be a little bit skeptical on that, I have to say. And I did one time brought him to a sales meeting with one of the top printing companies, printer manufacturers. It had the CEO, all the top executives of marketing and sales, and it was very dysfunctional. The organization was pretty dysfunctional at the time. And at the end of the sales call, I sort of said to him, I said, okay, go and ask them. And he literally said, he said to the CEO, he said, if I sent you an invoice for this meeting, would you pay it? And the CEO said, actually, I would, because you've uncovered a lot of issues here that we need to address. So talk about creating value in the process.
Yeah, I think Neil was ahead of the curve in many, many areas, as you know, as have you been. So I think you're both right. Unfortunately, a lot of salespeople struggle with this, and it's for a variety of reasons. I think to your point, especially nowadays, even more than when Neil first said it, I think it's truer because people now demand value in every stage of the sales process. I know when I first got started, a lot of people, not all, but a lot would tolerate, and tolerates the word, waiting for value till they bought my product or service. Today they won't. If you don't give value, they disconnect and they move on or they do nothing. So value must be given on every sales call. That's one of the rules at my firm. Every time we talk to someone, we follow up with someone, you have to give something of value. It cannot be seller centric. It must always be focused on the buyer, or don't make the call because you won't be able to be effective. It's got to constantly be giving value. And so I think that's an important point, is that value is created in the mind of the buyer.
Right.
And oftentimes as salespeople, I think that's one of the root problems with value creation is we narcissistically put ourselves in place of the buyer and we say, okay, if I were in their position, what would I value? And then we sell to a version of ourselves, essentially. And so what we talk about in the book is some real world strategies you can use to truly understand your buyer. And then also, how do you apply value so that they can perceive it, so that they see the value? So, as you well said, that someone would see enough value in the sales call where they'll pay you for it. Because if they'll pay you for it, if they see value, they'll continue the sale. They'll respond to your calls. They'll respond to your emails. So value creation is mission critical. And I think that's one of the big reasons why sales stall. And one research study we cite in the book from Forrester found that 88% of the buyers surveyed in the study believe that the salespeople they meet with on a regular basis do not understand their business enough or to present value. So the sales call is very seller centric. The buyer just simply puts up with it to get to the end and to find out if they can use the product or service. And most buyers won't do that anymore, so they disconnect. They won't return your calls, and we wonder why. So value creation is absolutely mission critical, and I agree 100%. We need to focus on it not at the end of the sale, but
Right.
throughout every part of the sale.
Yeah, and that's why I just don't think any longer that salespeople can get away without having a pretty advanced level of business acumen. And I don't,
Yes.
and I mean, understanding the business of business and understanding the business of their buyers. Because, like you say, if somebody calls you up, I mean, because I get it. I mean, I'm sure you do. I mean, I get people who contact me trying to sell me CRMs, and I'm like, huh? Have you not done some basic research here? So it is quite amazing. Here, so let's talk about closing, right? Because you mentioned closing earlier as one of the areas that that's problematic. So you have a chapter, closing redefined. So how do you define or redefine closing?
Yeah, looking at it holistically as something that's happening throughout this sale. And I don't mean ABC nonsense, always be closing or anything like that. We mean selling to the way the brain it forms a buying decision with those incremental commitments. So don't think of closing as one commitment that happens at the end of the sale. Think of it as a series of strategic commitments that's happening throughout the sale that guides that prospect on that progression of consent and naturally advances the sale. And in the book, we show, how do you present in a way that'll enable you to get those commitments? How do you set up the commitments? Meaning you don't just ask, we use what's called choice architecture. So what comes before the commitment shapes the perception of it. And so what do you do right before? We have some strategies in the book on that. How do you ask for commitments? And then what happens if you don't get a commitment once you ask for it? So someone gives you a weak, wishy-washy response like, well, I'm not sure, maybe. Well, that's not a commitment when I ask for it. So what do you do then? And I think this is just such an important topic, because what I've seen is that when salespeople get this point, they're able to do some astounding things, because when commitments really tell you how you're doing in the sale. And whenever you don't get a sale, you should know why, and your commitments tell you that. When you're struggling to get a commitment, that's a weakness in your sales process, and you need to address that. And so commitments are literally the building blocks of the sale, and because of that, there are powerful data points that we can use to continually improve and to leverage them. So I think of the sale essentially as a series of strategic commitments. I mean, that's exactly, I present, everything I do is to get a commitment, a certain commitment. And I know if I do that, I'm going to win almost every time. And where I struggle, I need to focus on those commitments. So it's, I think, absolutely mission critical to redefine closing, to rethink how we view it, not as something that happens at the end of the sale, but something that's also happening throughout the sale and it's manifested at the end.
Yeah, so hopefully any salespeople or maybe prospective salespeople listening, that's a great takeaway from today. As you go through your sales process, take a look and see, are you getting incremental commitments? And if you're not getting incremental commitments, it probably means your sales process is doomed or is not going to move forward at the speed that you would certainly like. Okay, David, so let's finish up today talking about the future of sales. There's a lot of prognosticators out there. There's a lot of people saying, "Oh, the death of the salesperson. Salespeople are going to go away," or "It's all moved to social selling," or "It's all this." You know, people love these kind of zero-sum statements.
Yes.
But you talk a bit about your vision of the future of sales.
Yes, I think we have a great future ahead. I know a couple of years ago it was all everything's going to salespeople are going to go away because of the technology. And now the new thing is AI is coming, so salespeople won't be. No one ever talks about accounting is going to go away because of a new technology, or
Right.
lawyers, but it's always just salespeople. Interestingly enough, real quickly, we have an article on our website called "Are Salespeople Necessary?" And what I did, this is a couple of years ago, I wrote this, but I looked at historically throughout every major technological invention throughout the 20th century, the promise has always been, and salespeople will not be necessary. I mean, from the early part of the 20th century, every 30 years or so, the promise is made. And the reality is it's not true. I think salespeople aren't going anywhere. In fact, I think our brightest days are ahead of us. I think
Mm-hmm.
this science is a game changer for us. When people get exposed to this wealth of research that really helps us align how we sell with how people buy and how they form choices, it changes everything. It allows us to really align how we sell and really be more predictably effective and to really help our buyers make choices. So I think our brightest days are ahead of us as we apply the science. And in the book, we talk about the word sales truth. And we say this is going to be a big factor. And that is, why do you sell the way you do? Why this way versus some other way? And I think the good news is there is a wealth of research we can pull from now to say, if you don't know why you sell the way you do, you probably shouldn't be doing it.
Mm-hmm.
There's so much evidence now that we don't have to guess our way to success anymore. I say selling does not have to be a faith-based initiative. You don't have to hope that it's going to work. We know the certain behaviors that enable high levels of sales performance, so why not utilize them? They're based on decades of science, and when you do, you develop a competitive advantage over your competitors who are not, who are selling via the old ways. And so I think that as science begins to permeate selling, it's going to bring us back into academia, which will help foster this innovation and growth. And it's really going to allow us to better serve our customers and innovate by focusing solely on our buyers and not so much on ourselves. And I think our best days are very much ahead of us.
Yeah, and we would totally agree with you. Nikolas Kilmer, the CEO of Pipeliner, he has written extensively about entrepreneurialism and salespeople and about how sales is trade and trade has a peacekeeping component, because if
Mm,
buyers and sellers are interacting and both are seeing value in the process and both are becoming prosperous as a result, then you can't have conflict in that equation because it doesn't work, right? So, in fact, I think we certainly believe that salespeople have an extremely important role going forward and can be, as we call them in our new magazine, the purveyors of prosperity for everyone.
mm.
David, to finish up, why don't you tell people a little bit again about the book and about what else you do and how they can contact you?
Yeah, the book that just came out called The Science of Selling. It's a lot of great feedback from people. People seem to really resonate with the message of the book. The great thing about this book is it's all grounded in science, as I've mentioned, but it's very practical. It's not a textbook. It's not a journal. It's a very practical, easy to understand book that as soon as you read it, when you put it down, you can begin to implement these strategies right away to become more effective. And if you want to learn more about science-based selling, in addition to the book, which is available on Amazon, Barnes& and Noble, anywhere fine books are sold, you can pick up your copy. You can also go to our website, Hoffeld, Hoffeld group.com. A lot of great resources on there as well, articles, white papers, blogs, podcasts. Learn more about the science-based selling. And then, of course, we have workshops. We have some amazing e-learning that's coming out later in 2017. Going to be, unbelievable with real sales simulations, robust reporting, over 100 different lessons, really powerful stuff that allows you to apply this. So if you're interested in anything like that, you can contact me and our team via our Hoffeld Group website. So we look forward to hearing from you soon.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I'd highly recommend David and his group, and I'd highly recommend you read the book. There's so many business books that come out every year, but this is one, and sales books, but this is one rooted in real science and research. And it took you, how long would you say it's taken to put this book together?
Yeah, the whole research was about 12 years, so it was extensive. In the book, we're leveraging thousands of scientific studies. I mean, even in the book itself, there's over 400 different just citations in the book. So if you want to get deeper into the research, you certainly can in the back. So it was an undertaking, about 12 years of work.
Well, it's well worth it. All right. Well, thanks, David, for joining us today, and look forward to talking to you again soon. David often contributes to our publications and our SalesPOP magazine, so look out for David there. All right. Thank you,
All right,
David.
thanks, John.